The crystal chandelier of the Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom cast a blinding, brilliant reflection over 150 elite guests, all holding their breath. The soft, classical violin music faded into an uneasy silence as my fiancé, Julian, pulled the $200,000 platinum ring from his velvet box. But instead of taking my hand, he took a step to his right. Right toward his lifelong best friend, Sienna Croft. "Consider this a warning, Victoria," Julian whispered into his lapel microphone, his voice echoing through the massive room with terrifying clarity. "If you don't sign over voting control of your father's firm by midnight, she gets the ring, and your place in this family." The crowd gasped in collective horror. Whispers erupted like wildfire across the golden tables. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her face draining of color. Sienna stood there in her champagne dress, a triumphant, smug smirk painted across her lips as Julian slid the diamond onto her finger. They expected me to break. They expected tears, a screaming match, or a desperate plea for him to stop. They thought my quiet nature was weakness. They mistook my composure for fragility. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. My pulse didn't even spike. I calmly reached into my satin clutch, pulled out a heavy gold Montblanc pen, and pulled out the joint trust fund agreement Julian's legal team had pressed me to bring to the reception. With a swift, deliberate motion, I drew a thick black line through Julian Sterling's name. I looked straight into his arrogant, expectant eyes, stepped up to the microphone, and smiled. "Keep the ring, Julian," I said, my voice smooth, steady, and loud enough to cut through the hum of the crowd. "You're going to need to pawn it to pay your legal fees." Julian's smug expression flickered for a fraction of a second, confusion momentarily piercing through his self-righteous armor. "What are you talking about, Victoria? Stop playing games. Sign the paper, or Vance Logistics leaves your hands forever." "Vance Logistics was never in your hands to begin with, Julian," I replied softly, taking 2 steps toward him. "And as of 45 seconds ago, neither is your personal bank account." Sienna's smirk dissolved. "Julian, what is she talking about? Tell her to stop making a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Sienna," I said, glancing down at the sparkling diamond on her hand. "I'm executing a foreclosure. That ring was purchased using an American Express card backed by Vance Logistics Corporate Credit, an account I personally froze at 5 p.m. today. That ring isn't a gift, Sienna. It's state's evidence." Julian's face turned pale. You can't touch that account. I have signatory authority." "You had authority," a deep, authoritative voice called out from the head table. Dominic Hayes, my chief legal strategist, stood up, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket as he walked toward the stage. He held a crisp leather portfolio in his left hand. "As of 3 hours ago, Mr. Sterling, the board of directors convened an emergency session based on evidence of grand larceny and corporate embezzlement. Your authority has been stripped, your assets frozen, and your access badges revoked." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Julian turned wildly toward his father, who was staring in utter disbelief from the front row. "Dad, do something. She's bluffing." "She isn't bluffing, Julian," I said, stepping closer until I was inches from his face. "You thought you were playing me for 2 years. You thought you and Sienna were so clever, siphoning funds into Cayman shell companies, trying to force my hand before the annual audit next month. You brought me to this altar thinking you could bully me into giving up my late father's legacy." Julian grabbed my wrist, his composure finally shattering, his grip tight and desperate. "Victoria, listen to me. We can talk about this in private. Don't do this here." I looked down at his grip on my wrist, then back up into his panicked eyes. "Take your hands off me, Julian." Dominic stepped between us, placing a firm, heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, forcing him to let go. "Touch her again, Mr. Sterling, and the police waiting in the lobby won't wait for the reception to end." "Police?" Sienna gasped, stepping back and frantically pulling at the ring, trying to yank it off her finger. "Julian, you said she knew nothing. You said she was just a stupid, grieving daughter who signed whatever you put in front of her. She was counting on it, Dominic said cold-heartedly, handing Julian a thick packet of legal documents bound in red tape. You've both been served. Federal injunction, total freeze on all Sterling Development liquid assets, and a summons for corporate fraud. Julian dropped the papers, the sheets scattering across the floral arrangements on the floor. He stared at me like he was looking at a complete stranger. For 2 years, he had seen me as the grieving daughter who inherited Vance Logistics after my father's sudden passing, a quiet girl who preferred spreadsheets to confrontation. He had spent months subtly undermining my authority, gaslighting me in front of the board, and feeding information to Sienna's fake investment firm. What he didn't realize was that I had discovered their paper trail 30 days ago. Every fake invoice, every wire transfer, every late-night meeting in Sienna's penthouse, I had tracked it all with surgical precision. I had let this wedding proceed not because I loved him, but because I needed every single one of his major investors, bank representatives, and socialite backers sitting in this very room to witness his downfall in real time. Victoria, please, Julian stammered, his voice cracking as he looked around at the room full of high-profile investors who were already turning their backs, taking out their phones, and calling their brokers. My family, my father's firm, this will ruin us. You ruined yourself the moment you mistook my patience for weakness, I said quietly, leaning in so only he could hear. This isn't the end, Julian. This is just the first minute of your new life. I turned on my heel, took my mother's arm, and walked down the aisle toward the grand exit of the Plaza Hotel. Behind me, I could hear Sienna sobbing and Julian frantically yelling my name, but I didn't look back once. As the heavy oak doors opened into the crisp Manhattan evening, Dominic fell into step beside me, pulling out his phone. Plan Omega is active, Victoria. The auditors are entering Sterling headquarters right now, and the press release hits the Wall Street Wire in 10 minutes. Good, I said, stepping into the back of the waiting black sedan. What about the offshore accounts in Nassau? Dominic smiled, a cold, sharp expression. That's the best part. Julian thinks he still has his safety net there. He has no idea what we set up for tomorrow morning. I looked out the tinted window as the Plaza Hotel faded into the distance. The real trap hadn't even sprung yet. The morning sun over Manhattan cut through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Vance Logistics Tower. Outside, the city moved at its usual relentless pace, unaware of the quiet execution happening inside my boardroom. Dominic stood near the mahogany conference table, setting down a pair of steaming espresso cups before opening his leather briefcase. Beside him sat my mother, Evelyn, looking remarkably composed in her deep navy suit. The faint red around her eyes from the previous night was gone, replaced by the sharp, protective steel that had defined her 40 years beside my father. The Wall Street Wire hit at 6 a.m., Dominic said, sliding a tablet across the dark wood toward me. Sterling Development stock is down 32% before the opening bell. Their primary institutional lender, First National, has already placed a temporary freeze on their line of credit based on the public fraud injunction. I picked up the tablet, skimming the headlines. Plaza Hotel scandal, Sterling heir facing embezzlement audit. The financial press was having a field day, but the market damage was just the surface level. What about the Nassau transfers? I asked, taking a slow sip of the dark roast. Dominic leaned in, a razor-thin smile touching his lips. Julian made for panicked wire attempts between 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. from his penthouse. He was trying to pull $1.8 million out of the Nassau holding account, the money he thought was safely hidden away in Sienna's name. And, my mother asked softly, resting her hands on her lap. He found out the account didn't belong to Sienna's shell company anymore, Dominic replied. What Julian never realized was that the original incorporation documents for that Nassau entity required a dual-signature corporate seal from Vance Logistics. When Victoria discovered the illicit transfers last month, we didn't block the account. We exercised our contractual right to assume management control due to breached fiduciary duty. So when he tried to pull the money out, I said. He didn't just get rejected, Dominic completed the thought. The system automatically flagged the attempt as an unauthorized withdrawal from a corporate account under federal monitoring. The Southern District Prosecutor's Office now has a real-time, digital paper trail of Julian Sterling personally trying to move stolen funds in the middle of the night. Before I could answer, the glass door to my outer office clicked open. My executive assistant, Sarah, walked in with a look of restrained anxiety on her face. "Victoria," Sarah said quietly, "Julian is downstairs in the lobby." Security stopped him at the turnstiles because his badge is deactivated, but he's refusing to leave. He's causing a scene in front of the morning staff. My mother set her cup down with a sharp clink. "Call the police, Sarah. Have him escorted off the property." "No," I said, standing up and smoothing down my tailored white blazer. "Let him up. Send him to conference room B, not here. Give him 5 minutes to stew alone." Dominic nodded, already retrieving a secondary folder from his bag. "I'll have security stand right outside the door." 10 minutes later, I walked into conference room B. Julian was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His designer suit from the night before was rumpled, his hair unwashed, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of a man who hadn't slept a second. The arrogant posture he had held at the Plaza Hotel was gone, replaced by a jittery, desperate energy. The moment the door closed behind me, he lunged forward, stopping only when he saw Dominic step into the room right behind me. "Victoria." Julian gasped, his voice raspy and desperate. "You need to fix this. You have to call off the auditors. The bank locked my father out of our operational accounts. We can't even cover payroll this Friday." I walked to the head of the glass table, pulled out a chair, and sat down calmly. I gestured for him to take a seat across from me. He didn't sit, he just gripped the back of a chair until his knuckles turned white. "You brought this on yourself, Julian," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You stood in front of 150 people, and handed my father's ring to Sienna as leverage." "That was a mistake," he stammered, sweating through his shirt collar. It was a business tactic, Victoria. Sienna convinced me that if we showed absolute force, your mother would step in and push you to transfer the voting shares so we could merge the logistics lines. I never meant to actually hurt you. A business tactic. I repeated, letting out a short, quiet laugh that made him flinch. You spent 2 years siphoning operational capital out of my company's regional fuel accounts. You altered supply chain invoices. You were building Sienna, a fake investment capital firm, using my family's money while telling me to my face that you loved me. I do love you, he yelled, leaning over the table. Sienna is nothing. She knew the offshore structures. I was doing it for us, so Sterling Development wouldn't be swallowed by your board. Save the performance for the federal grand jury, Julian, Dominic interjected dryly, laying open the folder. We have 16 months of recorded wire transactions bearing your signature, cross-referenced with IP addresses originating from your personal laptop. Julian stared at the documents on the table, his breath coming in short, ragged hitches. Victoria, please. My father had nothing to do with this. If the Sterling name goes down, his health won't survive it. He built that firm for 30 years. And my father built Vance Logistics for 40, I replied, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the glass. Yet you had no problem planning to strip it down and sell off its assets to Sienna's creditors. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between me and Dominic. What do you want? Tell me what you want to drop the criminal charges. I'll sign over my personal shares in Sterling. I'll give you everything. I looked at him for a long, heavy moment. The man I thought I was going to marry was completely hollow, reduced to begging for scraps of mercy he had never intended to give me. I don't want your shares, Julian, I said softly. They're going to be worthless by noon anyway. I pulled out my phone, pressed play on an audio file, and set it face up on the table. Sienna's voice filled the room, crystalline and mocking, recorded from a hidden microphone in my private dining room 3 weeks prior. Once Victoria signs the voting proxy at the rehearsal dinner, we stripped the fleet assets first. Her mother is too weak to fight back anyway. She'll be living in a suburban retirement home by winter. Then came Julian's voice on the tape, laughing. She's too naive to even look at the ledger footnotes. She trusts me completely. Julian froze. Every drop of blood drained from his face as the recording finished playing. You recorded us, he whispered, horror dawning in his eyes. I recorded everything, I said, picking up my phone and standing up. Dominic has already delivered a copy of that tape to your father's board of directors. As we speak, your father is holding an emergency meeting to remove you from the executive board to save what little reputation the Sterling family has left. No. Julian stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the door handle. No, my dad wouldn't do that to me. He already did, Dominic said, checking his watch. The press release from Sterling Development announcing your immediate termination was issued 3 minutes ago. Julian stared at us, utterly shattered, the final reality of his destruction washing over him. He opened the door and stumbled out into the hallway, where 2 security officers were waiting to escort him out of the building forever. I walked over to the window, looking out over the city skyline as the morning sun reached its peak. He's finished, Dominic said quietly from behind me. Sterling Development will survive in name only, stripped of its main contracts. Julian faces up to 12 years for corporate fraud. What about Sienna? I asked without turning around. She's currently trying to liquidate her art collection to pay her retainer for a criminal defense attorney, Dominic replied. But she doesn't know about the civil lawsuit we're filing against her firm at 2 p.m. today. I smiled into the reflection of the glass. The court cases were just the formality. The real strike was scheduled for tomorrow. By 2 p.m., the marble lobby of the Manhattan Supreme Court was swarming with financial reporters, camera crews, and corporate onlookers. The news of Vance Logistics filing a $14 million civil racketeering lawsuit against Sienna Croft and her boutique investment firm, Croft Capital, had broken less than an hour earlier. Dominic and I walked through the side entrance, stepping into the high-ceilinged corridor outside courtroom 302. My mother walked beside us, her posture regal, holding her chin high as camera flashes burst through the glass doors behind us. Sienna was already there, pacing near the defense bench alongside a visibly stressed, silver-haired attorney. She was no longer wearing the sleek champagne designer dress from the Plaza Hotel. Instead, she wore an oversized dark navy coat, her eyes covered by thick dark sunglasses despite being indoors. But when she saw me walk through the oak doors, she whipped off her glasses, her eyes flashing with pure rage. "You psychotic bitch!" Sienna hissed, breaking away from her lawyer, and taking 3 aggressive steps toward me. "You froze my firm's payroll accounts. My landlords locked the doors to my Madison Avenue office this morning." Dominic immediately stepped in front of me, raising a hand. "Keep your distance, Ms. Croft, or I'll have the bailiff place you in custody for contempt before the judge even takes the bench." Sienna's lawyer scrambled forward, grabbing her arm and forcing her back toward their table. "Sienna, sit down and shut up. You're making this worse. She destroyed my business in 6 hours." Sienna snapped, her voice trembling with a terrifying mix of fury and panic. She looked past Dominic, glaring directly at me. "You think you're so smart, Victoria." Julian was the one who pulled the trigger on the transfers. He brought me the ledger files. I was just an advisor. I stopped, looking down at her with unbothered, freezing calm. An advisor who took a 20% finder's fee on every illegal wire transfer from my late father's legacy accounts. An advisor who personally signed the Shell Corporation filings in Shell Bay. I didn't know where the money was coming from, she lied desperately, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden railing. "You knew," I said softly, my voice carrying cleanly across the quieted courtroom. "You knew so well that you spent $40,000 of Vance Logistics operational capital on a custom diamond ring, the very ring you were wearing while standing next to my fiancé on my wedding stage." Sienna flinched as if she had been slapped. The few reporters who had managed to slip into the gallery were rapidly scribbling notes in their pads. That ring was legally seized by federal marshals 2 hours ago, Sienna, Dominic added smoothly, unfastening his briefcase on our table. Along with your 3 personal vehicles, your penthouse lease holdback, and your offshore investment portfolios. Sienna's lawyer leaned in close to her, whispering frantic instructions, but her face had already turned ash gray. She was beginning to realize the brutal reality of the legal machine I had set into motion. It wasn't just a criminal charge that Julian was facing, it was a total, systematic liquidation of every asset she had built through fraud over the past 3 years. The double doors at the front of the courtroom opened, and Judge Harrison took the bench. Within 15 minutes, the proceedings were over. Given the overwhelming digital evidence, the signed wire authorizations, and the joint criminal indictment handed down by the Southern District, the judge granted our motion for an immediate asset freeze and an expedited trial date. As we walked out of the courtroom, Sienna sat frozen at her table, her head in her hands, listening to her lawyer explain that no bail bondsman in the city would touch her case without liquid collateral she no longer possessed. That handles Croft Capital, Dominic said as we descended the grand stone steps outside the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. Her firm is effectively bankrupt. The state licensing board will revoke her financial advisory credentials by tomorrow morning. And Julian, my mother asked, her voice tight. Julian is currently sitting in his father's study with 3 corporate defense attorneys, Dominic replied, pulling out his tablet to check a fresh notification. His father, Arthur Sterling, just issued a formal public apology to Vance Logistics on behalf of Sterling Development. They are offering a full out-of-court settlement to avoid a public trial. I paused at the bottom of the steps, looking over at Dominic. What are they offering? They're offering to return the entire $4 million in embezzled funds, plus interest, and surrender Julian's remaining non-voting shares in Sterling Development back to our holding group for $1. My mother turned to me, a look of quiet relief settling over her features. Victoria, that covers all our losses. It completely restores the company. No, I said quietly, looking up at the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. It restores what they stole. It doesn't pay for the betrayal. Dominic looked at me, a subtle, knowing grin touching his lips. What are your instructions, boss? Reject the settlement, I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. Tell Arthur Sterling that if he wants to save his company from complete liquidation, he surrenders Julian to the federal prosecutors without a defense plea agreement. Julian serves the full 12 years, or Sterling Development goes down with him. Dominic nodded once, his fingers already typing out the response to Sterling's legal team. Consider it done. That evening, I returned to my father's old study in our family home. The room was quiet, filled with the scent of old leather books and mahogany polish. I walked over to the heavy oak desk, picking up a framed photograph of my father standing in front of our very first shipping container 30 years ago. We saved it, Dad, I whispered, tracing the edge of the silver frame. And we made sure nobody will ever try to take it again. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from an unknown number. I opened it. Victoria, please. It's Julian. My dad kicked me out of the house. The bank locked my cards. I'm staying at a motel near Queens. Please, just talk to me for 5 minutes. I'll do whatever you want. I stared at the screen for 3 seconds. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel heartbreak. I felt nothing at all. I deleted the message, blocked the number, and set the phone face down on the desk. The final phase of Plan Omega was set for tomorrow morning, at the Sterling Development annual shareholder meeting. And Julian was about to find out what happens when the people you tried to destroy stop showing mercy. The grand auditorium of the Sterling Development headquarters was packed to capacity for the annual emergency shareholder meeting. The room buzzed with an anxious, oppressive energy. Dozens of high-net-worth investors, board members, and financial journalists filled the leather seats, watching the stage where Arthur Sterling sat flanked by 4 senior defense attorneys. Julian's father looked 20 years older than he had 48 hours ago. His shoulders were slumped, his hands visibly trembled as he adjusted his notes, and the sharp confidence of a billionaire patriarch was completely shattered. From the back corner of the room, standing near the heavy double doors, sat Julian. He was wearing a faded jacket he'd clearly borrowed, his face pale, eyes hollowed out with dark shadows. He wasn't permitted on stage. He was sitting in the back like an outcast, ignored by every investor who used to shake his hand, waiting to see if his father could pull off a miracle to save their family name. At precisely 10 a.m., the heavy oak doors at the main entrance swung open. The hum in the auditorium died down instantly. Every head turned as I walked down the center aisle, dressed in a tailored crimson suit, flanked by Dominic Hayes and my mother. We didn't take seats in the audience. We walked straight up the side steps and onto the main stage. Arthur Sterling stood up, his voice cracking slightly into the microphone. "Victoria, please. This is an internal shareholder meeting. We are currently voting on the corporate restructuring plan." "The restructuring plan is void, Arthur," Dominic said loudly, stepping up to the podium and placing a certified legal document onto the lectern. "Because as of 9:30 this morning, Vance Logistics acquired 61% of Sterling Development's outstanding debt obligations from First National Bank." A sudden, collective gasp rippled through the auditorium. Investors sat up straight, frantic murmurs breaking out across the floor. Julian bolted out of his chair in the back of the room, his eyes wide with horror as he gripped the back of the row in front of him. You bought our debt?" Arthur stammered, gripping the edges of the table. "Your company was over-leveraged by $22 million, Arthur," I said, stepping up to the microphone, my voice echoing clearly through the speaker system. "You backed your lines of credit using expected revenue from a merger with Vance Logistics, a merger your son attempted to force through extortion and grand larceny." I turned to face the crowd of investors, looking each of the major shareholders directly in the eyes. "Julian Sterling didn't just try to steal my father's legacy," I continued calmly. "He gambled your money, your portfolios, and your trust on a cheap, arrogant scheme with Sienna Croft. As the majority holder of your company's primary debt notes, Vance Logistics is executing an immediate restructuring call. We are calling the loans due today." Panic broke out across the auditorium. Board members stood up, shouting over each other, demanding answers from Arthur. Arthur turned to me, his eyes pleading, tears welling at the corners of his eyelids. "Victoria, I spent my entire life building this firm. Don't destroy my life's work for my son's arrogance. I beg you." I looked over at Arthur, feeling a brief pang of sympathy for a father ruined by his son's greed, but my voice remained absolute steel. "I'm not destroying your firm, Arthur," I said quietly. "Julian destroyed it the second he thought he could use my heart as leverage. I am simply collecting what is owed." Dominic stepped forward, presenting the final terms. "Vance Logistics will assume operational control of Sterling Development's logistics assets, securing every single employee job and investor yield. But under one non-negotiable condition." Dominic turned and looked straight at Julian in the back of the auditorium. "Arthur Sterling surrenders all legal defense funds allocated for Julian Sterling. Julian will plead guilty to all federal fraud and racketeering counts without a plea deal." The entire room fell dead silent. Everyone turned to look at Julian. Julian's breath hitched. "Dad, no," he screamed from the back of the hall, his voice cracking with pure terror. "Dad, don't do it. Don't let her do this to me." Arthur closed his eyes, a heavy tear slipping down his weathered cheek. He looked at his ruined firm, looked at the hundreds of investors staring at him, and then looked at his son, the boy who had burned their empire down out of pure vanity. Arthur slowly lowered his head and signed the restructuring agreement. "No!" Julian shrieked, stumbling backward into the aisle. Before he could reach the exit doors, two federal marshals in plain clothes stepped into the frame from the lobby, blocking his path. They grabbed Julian's arms, pulled them firmly behind his back, and clicked a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. "Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for federal corporate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy," the marshal announced loudly, his voice echoing across the auditorium. Victoria. Victoria, please. Julian sobbed, thrashing against the marshal's grip as they marched him down the hallway toward the waiting police escort outside. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please don't do this to me. Victoria. I stood on the stage, watching him get led away in cuffs. I didn't feel triumph, nor did I feel spite. I felt the deep, profound peace of justice fully delivered. 6 months later. The summer sun streamed brightly across the penthouse balcony of the brand-new Van Sterling Global headquarters. Below, the bustling port of Manhattan hummed with activity as dozens of our newly acquired supply ships lined the docks, bearing the crisp gold emblem of Vance Logistics. Dominic walked out onto the balcony, holding 2 glasses of sparkling champagne. He handed one to my mother, who sat comfortably in a teak lounge chair, reading the financial section of the New York Times. Page 3, my mother said, smiling softly as she tapped the newspaper. Sienna Croft was sentenced to 6 years in state prison for financial fraud. Her civil bankruptcy liquidation is officially complete. And Julian? I asked, leaning against the balcony railing, taking a slow sip of champagne. His plea deal was finalized yesterday, Dominic replied smoothly. 8 years in federal custody, 0 parole eligibility for the first 5, and $4.2 million in mandatory restitution. I looked out over the sparkling expanse of the Hudson River. The man who had tried to intimidate me at the altar, who had handed my ring to his best friend as a warning to break my spirit, was now sitting in a cold concrete cell, stripped of his name, his money, and his freedom. He had tried to use a wedding ring as a weapon of fear. But he forgot that a woman who builds her own foundation cannot be broken by a man who only knows how to steal. My mother raised her glass toward the skyline. To your father, Victoria. And to the future. I tapped my glass against hers, a quiet, confident smile touching my lips as the Manhattan breeze swept past. To the future, I said.